So, last time we have discussed about the structure of training program through research. I have mentioned in the previous module, that is, you have to first come out with the topic. Topic may be suggested by the organization or topic may be offered by the trainer. For example, we have taken two topics: empowering leadership and employee loyalty. First, we will brief about the concept, that is the employee loyalty and empowering leadership. Both I have discussed, that is how first we have to discuss with the trainees, give them the concepts, and now we will ask them to go to fill the standard scale. Last time I have mentioned, that is the scale we can adopt from the database published by Scopus, SCI, SSCI or ABDC listed journals. So, these are the certain recognized reputed databases from where these we can take these scales. Now, concept is discussed, now we are taking the scales. What is the scale? That I have discussed in the previous module, that is the scale is a questionnaire which is having the high reliability and validity, and that scale can be from the different sources. This scale can be from the Indian authors, it can be from the foreign authors. Now, here for the empowering leadership, we have taken Ahearn, Matthew and Reps 2005 scale. Now, this particular scale is having these four dimensions: dimensions of enhancing the meaningfulness of work, fostering participation in decision making, expressing confidence in high performance, and providing autonomy from bureaucratic constraints. Now, in the bracket you see the 3 figure. 3 figure is the number of items. What are the number of items? Number of items are the statements which are given under this particular dimension. So, we will say empowering leadership is a variable. Under these there are 4 dimensions: enhancing the meaningfulness of work, fostering participation in decision making, expressing confidence in high performance, and providing autonomy from the bureaucratic constraints. So, these are the 4 dimensions. Each dimension is having the 3 items. So, therefore, we are talking about empowering leadership scale with the 12 items. What are those items? How to get it filled from the trainees, that I will come later. Second scale is, that is about employee loyalty. This scale is given by the INEOS on Bank and Laszlo 2013, and the reasons for being loyal to the company, that has been mentioned. Here also there are certain dimensions. So, employee loyalty is a variable. Dimensions are, or some people say factors, they are commitment to managers and company, job conditions, personal benefits, service element and location, career and status. So, these are the 5 dimensions are there. So, commitment to managers and company, this particular dimension is having the 5 items, job conditions is having the 5 items, personal benefits 4 items, items means statements, as I mentioned, statements given in this scale under this particular dimension. service element and location 4 dimension 4 items, and carrier and status it is having the 3 items. Now, we will go with this particular scale, the standard scale docs. Now, this particular standard scale this work is going is in process by my PhD scholar Mr. Abhishek Singh, and Abhishek will talk about this particular scale. Here Abhishek, please join me. Here you will find that is the first part, they are part A and part B. Part B will explain by Abhishek. Part A, as I mentioned, that is the demographic variables. We have to include the training, connect the training, integrate the training with research. For research, data will be required. To get that data, we have to also take the demographic variables. So, demographic variables are gender, marital status, number of years worked, then the positions. So, you can talk about level 1, level 2, level 3, education, does the education affect the employee empowering leadership and employee loyalty, age, and then the total work experience and name of job is there. So, they are the demographic variables like the gender, marital status, work experience, education and age. So, then that will be also there. Now, some of them may like to give the name, some of the respondents they do not like to give the name. So, it hardly matters. So, trainees are there. So, trainees may give the response, trainees may not give the name, trainees may give the name, trainees may not give the name, it hardly matters. But we have to ask them, that is the we want this particular data which will not disguise them, and therefore, in that case it will be that this particular information that will help in making the research. Now, here we will talk about, yes Abhishek.
Before distributing these all questionnaire, what we do, first we discuss the each item or each statement of this questionnaire with the participants, so that they can understand and they could give the appropriate marks on particular statements. So, we read in front of the participants, whoever is participating in that particular training program. So, here I will read these all items of empowering leadership. First 3 items explain in enhancing the meaningfulness of work. Next 3 explain the fostering the participation in decision making. Next 3 explain expressing confidence in high performance, and last 3 items of empowering leadership explain how to provide autonomy from the bureaucratic constraints. So, here we give instruction to the participant, read carefully and then give marks accordingly, like 1 for strongly disagree, 2 for disagree, 3 for more or less disagree, 4 for undecided, 5 for more or less agree, 6 for agree and 7 for strongly agree. Like I will read first statement, like my manager helps me understand how objective and goals relate to that of the company. So, here if subordinate feels that manager helps them to understand the organization objectives and goals and how it is related to their company, if manager explain, then they can give 7 or 6. If they feel it manager doesn't help, then they can give 1 or 2. So, that is how they can give their response on this questionnaire. After, so in the same way, we have for reasons for being loyal for that particular organization. So, we have 21 items for this also. So, accordingly these participants can give their their response on this questionnaire, and after that we can collect all questionnaires from the participants and very quickly we will put all their responses into we will enter these all responses into the Excel sheet, and then we will in the next step we will
that I will show in that it is the how in the Excel sheet we have to that he will discuss. Oh sorry, so you can go with the second.
Next slide.
Now the second part that we will talk about, that is the how the respondents the scales they are responding. So therefore we will take about this particular Excel sheet. Before going for the Excel sheet, I am sure you have gone through, that is the both the dimensions their items and their responses, whatever the responses they are giving, that will be there. Now how to enter into the Excel sheet, that Abhishek will brief.
So as you have seen that first part of the questionnaire, in that we have demographic variable, some variables are related to the job and some variables are related to the employee, like age, sex, and so these are the variables which are related to the employee. So we can open the Excel, and very neat and cleanly we can make some columns into it, and we can put this particular information. Like you can see in this Excel sheet, department is there, education is there, job position is there, total work X is there, state is there, and age is there. And why we are putting this information into this Excel? Because it helps us to make analyze this data very carefully. And here I will, in the later part we will discuss how this information is useful to analyze the data. So first thing that we have done was we have entered this demographic variable, and accordingly whatever they have given the response to the second part of the questionnaire, like first three item explain the enhancing the meaningfulness of work. So first respondent has given us 1, 1 and 1. It means they are strongly disagree. Whatever strongly disagree, that is what 1 stands for, and accordingly you can see 2, 3, 4, 5. So as we had discussed, it is a 7-point scale. So 1, 2, 3 is having strongly disagree to strongly agree.
Here I would also like to mention, that is if I will take on the 7-point scale. So therefore it is giving the broad canvas. Earlier the Likert scale was the 5-pointer, but nowadays we are talking about the 7-pointer. So therefore appropriate closeness to the response can be there, right?
Yes sir. So here you can see that we have made the column for enhancing the meaningfulness of work, and we have put the responses for all 3 items. In the same way for other 3 dimensions also we have done it. So here you can see 3 Excel sheet that we have prepared. In first that right now which Excel that you are seeing it, in that we have entered the responses for empowering leadership, and for next Excel we have put the employee loyalty. In this you can see we have entered the detail for employee loyalty and for all dimensions.
Now here you can easily see, that is the again this will be the same demographic variable for the same persons, same respondents. So this is there. Then you can go only one scale also. If you find it is in your training program and your classification of these sections are like this, that is you do not have the much time, because normally it has been observed that is these responses are to be taken in the presence of the trainer itself. Avoid to give one day before and ask them to come next day with responses to save the time. But whenever we are talking about the research, it becomes very important that is they go statement by statement. If there is any confusion to them, the trainer should be available to them to clarify. If any particular word is not clear, any particular sentence is not clear, they want to ask any confusion, if there is no clarity, then immediately the trainer can be accessed. So he is present in the class. So therefore that is if you give one day before, then they may guess some of the responses. So therefore the scientific way is, that is give in the class. Now suppose you do not have time for the 2 scales, then give 1 scale only, but the entry of the data is to be done there itself. Get the responses, data has to be entered, and then accordingly this particular data variable variable is the employee loyalty as you see, and then there is the commitment to managing company, then the job conditions, right, and the personal benefits, service elements and location, and the career and status. So, therefore, all the dimensions of the employee loyalty, the data has to be entered item wise, statement wise response is there and the total is there. Yes.
So, now we will explain how to interpret this data.
So, now we will go for this particular 1 minute. Now, we will talk about the relationship between these particular scales, and then how to go about this interpretation of this. So, what we have done? We have explained the concepts. After explaining the concepts, we have given them the scales. The scales they have responded. That response is taken on this particular Excel sheet, and now we have to tell them and interpret this particular response.
So, here you can see first for empowering leadership we have 4 dimensions, and for higher level of perception about the for higher level of perceived empowerment in the organization, how we will judge, like first 3 items they are giving score between 3 and 9, then we will say that these employees are those employees who are perceiving lower level of empowerment. If score comes between 10 and 15, then we will say these employees are having medium level of perceived empowerment. If score comes between 16 and 21, then we will say these are the employees who are having higher level of empowerment. Now, question comes how this score will come. So, here we are having 3 items. So, one item, if you are someone is giving minimum response, that is the 1. So, 3 items minimum score, that if we will add all 3 minimum score, then it comes 3. So, then we will say this is the minimum limit, and maximum limit how we will decide, because we have gone till 3, 1 to 3, it means this is the lower level of perceived empowerment. So, that is why 3 item multiply by 3, because we are saying 1 to 3 is a lower level of perceived empowerment.
Now, suppose somebody has given the in the first is 3, second is given 2 and third is given 4, right. So, his total will be 9. So, even if his total is 9, we will say it is the lower level of empowerment. So, in 3 items minimum will be 3, but if he gives, even if he gives the 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and whatever, but the total of these 3 items is 9 only. So, then in that case that employee's level of empowerment is low.
So,
medium.
So, here in the same way, like sir has explained how this medium level comes, in the same way if one participant is there who gives 5, 6 and 7. So, then we can add these all 3, 5, 6 and 7. So, it comes 18. So, here that we can see that it comes between 16 to 21. So, we will say that that employee perceived higher level of empowerment. So, that is how we will interpret this entire scale of.
Suppose medium level also please explain.
In the case of medium level, like one employee who gives 4 for one item, and for next 5 and for next 3. So, 4 plus 5 is 9 plus 3 is 12 plus 3 is 12. So, here we can see that the 12 comes between 10 to 15. So, then we will say this employee have perceived a medium level of empowerment.
Especially the enhancing the meaningfulness of work. If we are explaining the first row, then we will say he is having the medium level of enhancing the meaningfulness of work.
Which is the one of the dimension of empowering leadership. So in the same way we can interpret for fostering participation in the decision making, because this is also having the 3 items. Next dimension also has 3 items, and next dimension also has 3 dimensions. So we can interpret this scale in this way. But in the case of employee loyalty,
no, now here I would like to add that is a lower level of empowerment, that is a total score, right, of that particular variable, that will be between 12 to 36 if the score, then definitely in that case lower level of empowerment, and if it is 37 to 60 it is the medium level of empowerment, if between the 60 to 84 then it is the high level of empowerment. So we can see here. Now here, now this particular group of like 137, 138, this group is having the 5.8. What is the 5.8 is? 5.8 is enhancing the meaningfulness of work. So if this is, it means that these groups overall, that also you can identify, that is the overall is 5.8. So 5.8 means that it is having the, so we will talk about that particular 5.8 is there. So 5.8 is coming overall between the lower level of 3 to 9. If it is coming 3 to 9, the 5.8 is the response. It means that is they are having the low level of empowerment, and if there is a low level of empowerment, it means that is the we are required to increase their this meaningfulness of work. Now how, now the trainer's role, please understand here very important point, that is the how trainer. Now why it is the 5.8? Because this is 3, 6, 3, 6, 5. Why it is 3? Because 1, 1, 1. So therefore in that case, that whenever we are talking about these particular items and in the meaningfulness of work, if it is coming 1, it means that my manager helps me understand how my objectives and goals related to that of the company, and the response is 1, strongly disagree. It means manager does not help. Manager does not help to understand how that particular trainee's objectives and goals relate to that of the company. So what is to be done to improve these empowering leadership, meaningfulness of work? For that purpose, his manager is to be advised. The finding of this research is that is the manager is not helping to understand the link between the employee's goal and organizational goal or objectives of goals of the company. So therefore the result is that we have to make a recommendation, that is in this organization there is a need, that is the manager helps to understand the individual goals to the organizational goal, that manager has to give this particular type of training, right. So that is the one part of this is there. Now you were talking about the employee loyalty.
Like in employee loyalty, like empowering leadership, we have 5 dimensions. But here what is the important thing, like each dimension is having different number of items or statements. So because of that, here lower limit and higher limit of each dimension will differ. So like you can see for first dimension, which is having the 5 items, so we have the lower limit for lower level of loyalty, which is 5, and higher limit is 15. Calculation system is the same like we have discussed for the empowering leadership. Like if all if one respondent has given a small number, which is the 1 for all 5 items, so minimum score for all 5 dimensions is 5. If all members have, one member has given 3 marks for each dimension, then that higher limit for lower level of employee loyalty will be 15, because from 4 onwards, if someone is giving 4, then we will include into the medium level of loyalty. So here you can see the calculation system for these all dimension is the same like empowering leadership. So here you can see the scores for the first dimension, which is the managers and which is commitment to managers and company. But before explaining this, I would like to discuss the role of the demographic variable, because this demographic variable makes the very interesting finding in term of, like, if we are interested to know whether males are more loyal or females are more loyal. So here we have the data for males as well as for females. So here we can segregate the data for males and female, and then we can calculate and we can identify the who is more loyal, whether males or female. So that is the role of this demographic variable, that is the first variable, gender. In the same way, if we are interested to know married male or unmarried female, who is more loyal, so here we have the data for gender like male and female and marital status. Then we can check and we can identify who is more loyal. In the same way, we can identify the which department is more loyal to the organization, whether medical people are more loyal or non-medical, because I have collected this data from the hospital. So that is why I have divided all department into 2 categories, one is medical and another one is non-medical. So if we would like to know who is more loyal, whether medical people or non-medical, so that also we can easily identify. In the same way, education level, does education level has any impact on the loyalty? So that also we can do, like undergraduate, postgraduate and above postdoctorate, or such kind of classification that we can give into the education category, and then we can check whether undergraduate people are more loyal and postgraduate people are more loyal. And so that we can identify through this analysis,
these statistics,
and the role of trainer will why this particular group is loyal, that has to be explained by the trainer. And in the same way, we can identify from the job position, total work X, whether work X has any impact on loyalty. If someone is having 25 years of work X, whether that person is more loyal, or someone who is not having that experience, that person will be more loyal. 1 or 2 year experienced person will be more loyal. So that also we can calculate, and then we can identify the reason why this particular person is more loyal or not loyal. And in the state wise, geographical, because geography, as we know that India is a very diverse country, so each and every state is having different culture and their own beliefs, religions, so that also may have impact on the loyalty.
May or may not
have the impact. So that is
that we can identify.
That also we can identify through this statistics. So now I will talk about this first dimension score, total score, which comes 11.8. 11.8. It means again lower level of loyalty. It means employees are not very committed to manager and their company. So like this is a healthcare industry, hospital data, so these employees may not be loyal because they are having very high work pressure in the hospital, so they may have very constraint with the manager, or manager may not able to give the proper time to their subordinates. So there might be some issues because of that. Subordinate are not able to offer their commitment to the manager and company. It could be one reason, but while discussing with the participant, we need to understand what is the exact reason in that particular company. So in our next step, like suggesting some valuable inputs to that particular organization, we can incorporate in our report, and then we can give it to the organization as well. And likewise, we can explain these all dimensions as well as overall score for the empowering leadership. Like we can add these scores for all 4 dimensions, like we are having 12 items, so we can add the scores for all 12 dimensions, and then we can think whether overall all employees what they are feeling, whether they are feeling empowered or not, whether all employee of that particular organizations are loyal or not. So that is how we can make we can customize our finding according to the department, according to the positions, according to the males and females, and according or for or entire organization as well. So that is
here we have to also you may have a question, that is there are some in some dimensions there are 5 items, in some dimensions there are 4 items. So what we do, we take the average. So therefore, even though the items are more or less in the dimensions, but the whatever value is there, you bring the uniformity in the value, and then you can go for the different statistical test. But in training program in general, you can talk about, that is the whether you are having the high loyalty or it is group is having the high loyalty or low loyalty. If it is having the high loyalty, under which dimension they are higher, under which dimensions they are lower, under the which item they are higher, under which item they are lower, and like this you can interpret and tell and advise and help them, that is your this particular item is scoring less, as a result this dimension is scoring less, and therefore you have to improve on this particular item. As I mentioned, like I have job security, if the response is low, right, so then in that case it means that is the person is having that fear of the job. So we have to talk about, that is the people are concerned about the job security is there, and then we have to suggest them, there is the if he is having the high job security and the high is there, that is becoming the reason for being the loyal with the organization. Or if the score is lower, there is like my job is highly respected in the society. So therefore it is the person will be having this particular dimension which is high, because of the he is having the reason for the high respect in the society of his job, therefore he is liking his job very much. So like this type of interpretations will be there.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Anything else you want to say?
One important feedback that we have got from our training programs, like when we distribute these questionnaire to the participant, and when they read these all items carefully, they understand construct very well. When you are delivering the lecture, you are explaining it, they may not understand, but when they read these all items carefully one by one, they understand what exactly we are trying to say about empowering leadership and how it can be practiced at the organization. Because sometimes when we are talking about this empowering leadership or any concept, it could be a very much theoretical, but employee do not understand how it should be practiced, because they are not coming from the academic background, very strong academician who will understand these all things. But when you will give these items to them, they will understand, they will interpret it, and how they will help them to develop their employees. Like if I will say, take the example of my manager expressed the confidence in my ability to perform at a high level. So if some manager is there in the training that will understand how I can empower the employee, I need to believe in the abilities of the subordinate. So that is the one way to empower the employees. If we are talking about empowering leadership, manager may not understand, but by reading these all items, they can understand very well what exactly they need to do. So that is how we can increase the transfer of training. Like right after the training, they can implement such kind of behavior at their workplace in order to increase the satisfaction, productivity of the subordinates.
What are the limitations of this process?
Sometimes what happens, this social desirable response also there, like we were talking about loyalty to impress and management, that is the threat. In the same way, for this questionnaire, common method biasness and social desirable responses are the limitations. Like if I will give you a small example, like do you like your boss? If even you don't like, but still you have to say yes, I like my boss. So
maybe the boss might be also be present in the training program, so he may also see that is whether
yes,
you
sir.
like or
so
not.
Sometime what happened, like these, because we are making entire interpretation based on our responses. So sometime if employees are not honest and they are not giving appropriate responses, so our interpretation may go in wrong way also. So what we need to do before distributing this questionnaire, we need to discuss in detail with the participants so that they will give their honest response to their particular item in order to increase the effectiveness of that particular training program.
Right. There can be the other solutions also, that is the you can increase the sample size also.
Yes.
So therefore the error will be less. So second is that is you can apply the common method bias test, right,
also.
and then therefore that's by applying common method bias test you can minimize that error. And the third is, which is nowadays very popular, that is the does the statistical, because the statistical result will be more loyalty, better will be the growth of the organization, or the better will be the interpersonal relationship, right. But does it justifies with the help of the qualitative data, and for that purpose what I would like to say, that is whenever we are talking about these responses of the scales and the scores, please do not rely only on these quantitative data, but try to see the case studies. Qualitative data means please see the case studies, interviews of the people, content of the any organization, the manuals of the organization, the reports of the organizations, and then see that really that whatever we are talking on the basis of the quantitative, is it matching really with the other documents of the organization, and then if it is supporting, then definitely we can say that is our findings of the quantitative and supported by qualitative, their finding of the research is accurate. So thank you, Abhishek. So when we are talking about the scores with the respondents and suggesting some of the strategies, and therefore we can talk about whether the respondents are having the meaningfulness of the work, are they fostering the participation in decision making, are they expressing the confidence in the high performance, or they are providing the autonomy from the bureaucratic constraints, and therefore higher the score, better will be the interpretation. Now on basis of this we can prepare a detailed report, we can talk to the trainees, they can go item wise item, and then that interpretation can be done. We can help the trainees, that is how these different dimensions where they can enhance and they can increase their performance. So this detailed report will be there. I was talking about the training, research and in the consultancy. Now here when we are doing this survey, we are taking these findings, interpreting that, and finally we can prepare the report. This particular session I have started with the the training program in ABCD company. Now that ABCD companies, that detailed report that I can prepare on the basis of the responses, as Abhishek has also mentioned about this particular interpretation, we can go, we can develop a detailed report and then can suggest the model to the organization with the help of conducting the training program, taking responses, preparing the report, how organization can focus its future strategies. So this is all about the making the use of the training program with the help of the research findings, and developing a research environment in the organization. Thank you.